Marcus Ellington was 41 years old when the settlement papers were signed. The house keys were handed back across a lawyer's conference table, and Sandra walked out of his life wearing a smile she hadn't bothered to hide. For 16 years, Marcus had built things. He had taken a $12,000 inheritance from his father and turned it into a regional civil engineering firm with 43 full-time employees, contracts across 4 states, and a reputation for finishing under budget and ahead of schedule. It drove a 2014 Chevy Silverado with a dent along the rear quarter panel from a job site incident he'd never had repaired. He packed his own lunch. He kept a worn leather notebook in his shirt pocket where he wrote down every calculation twice before trusting it. He never announced himself walking into a room. Sandra had called his quality provincial. Her friends had a different word for it. They called him safe. She never corrected them. She filed on a Tuesday. By Thursday, her attorney had argued successfully that the firm Marcus had spent 16 years building was a marital asset subject to division. The valuation they submitted, a document prepared by an accountant Sandra had retained 4 months before she ever mentioned the word divorce, placed Ellington Engineering at $4.2 million. Sandra's demand was for half, $2.1 million, the house in Brentwood, and primary custody of the 2 cars she had picked out and he had paid for. What she didn't know was that Ellington Engineering had a holding structure Marcus had established 7 years earlier on advice from a tax attorney, a structure that kept the operating company legally distinct from the asset portfolio it had been steadily accumulating. What she didn't know was that the $4.2 million valuation her accountant had produced was looking at the wrong company. What she didn't know was that she had just handed back the keys to a man who was about to build something she could not touch, could not reach, and could not have imagined. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from, and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The alarm went off at 5:12 a.m. on the morning Marcus signed the settlement papers. He had been awake since 4 o'clock. He lay in the dark of the apartment he had rented 3 months earlier. 2nd floor, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that faced east, so the morning light came in early. And he stared at the ceiling and did the arithmetic he had been doing every morning for 3 months. Not the arithmetic of loss, the arithmetic of what remained. The apartment was temporary, and he knew it. He had furnished it with the minimum: a bed frame he assembled himself the first night, a kitchen table he found at an estate sale for $60, 2 chairs that didn't match, and a standing lamp in the corner that threw warm light across the room in the evenings. He had brought his tools. 3 red metal rolling toolboxes that he pushed against the wall of the 2nd bedroom, which he used as an office, his drafting board, his reference library, 30 years of engineering manuals, building codes, structural textbooks, arranged on shelves he had built from pine boards and steel brackets the first weekend he moved in. He had left the art. He had left the furniture Sandra chose. He had left the rugs and the throw pillows and the carefully curated aesthetic of a home that had never quite felt like his. He had taken his notebooks. There were 41 of them, one for every year he had been working, each one filled with calculations in his precise, compressed handwriting. They lined the top shelf of the office in chronological order. They were, he understood, the only autobiography that mattered. He got up at 5:12, made coffee in a French press he'd owned since graduate school, and stood at the east-facing kitchen window while the city below him woke up in slow stages. He drank the coffee black. He did not turn on the television. The silence was not heavy for him. He had always done his best thinking in silence, which was something Sandra had characterized as distance, and which he now understood she had experienced as indifference. He had not been indifferent. He had been building. There was a difference. It was a difference he had stopped trying to explain somewhere around year 8. He showered, dressed in work clothes, dark canvas pants, a gray Henley, steel-toed boots, and sat down at the kitchen table with his notebook and the document he needed to review before the 9 o'clock meeting. The document was 47 pages long. It had been prepared by his attorney, a man named Gerald Park, who had built his practice in commercial litigation and who had taken one look at the holding structure Marcus described and said, quietly and without ceremony, "They have no idea what they're looking at." Marcus had not smiled then. He had simply said, "I know." He had nodded once and uncapped his pen. The thing about the holding structure was that Marcus had not designed it as a defense. He had designed it as a foundation. 7 years earlier, when Ellington Engineering began generating consistent profit beyond what operations required, Marcus had sat with Gerald and a tax strategist named Dora Hines, and they had spent 3 Saturdays mapping out what a long-term asset structure should look like. They had talked about real estate. They had talked about private investment. They had talked about the way that operational companies were vulnerable to judgment and that the assets the operational company generated, if they were carefully and consistently moved into a separate holding structure, could be shielded from exactly the kind of valuation exercise Sandra's accountant had performed. Marcus had done this not because he suspected a divorce. He had done it because he was an engineer. An engineer's built for load-bearing, not for the average case, but for the maximum stress event. He had never told Sandra about the holding structure, not because he was hiding it, because she had never asked. He finished his coffee. He rinsed the cup. He picked up his jacket, checked the inside pocket for his notebook, and walked out into the morning. Gerald Park's office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown that Marcus had walked past 100 times before he ever had reason to enter it. The lobby had marble floors and a security desk and an elevator bank that moved without sound. Gerald was already at the conference table when Marcus arrived at 8:52, which was 8 minutes before the meeting was scheduled, which was how Marcus arrived everywhere. Gerald had coffee and 2 cups waiting. He was in his late 50s, compact, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a yellow legal pad covered in handwriting. Settlement went through this morning, Gerald said. Recorded at 8 a.m. Marcus sat down. Good. She got the house. The operating company's evaluated interest, the vehicles. Gerald looked at the legal pad. She got everything she asked for. I know. She thinks she got half. Marcus picked up the coffee. She got half of what she could see. What Sandra's attorney and Sandra's accountant had examined over 4 months of discovery was Ellington Engineering LLC, the operating company, the entity that held the contracts, the employees, the equipment, the accounts receivable, the reputation. It was a real company worth real money. The $4.2 million valuation was not wrong. It was simply incomplete. Ellington Holdings Group, the structure above it, was not an LLC. It was a series trust, established in a state with specific statutory protections. And it held 11 commercial properties across 3 states, a minority stake in a logistics technology firm Marcus had invested in quietly 5 years earlier, and an equity position in a real estate development project in the city's eastern corridor that had not yet broken ground, but that Marcus understood, from the engineering assessments he had personally reviewed, was going to be worth 8 times the entry price within 4 years. None of this had appeared in discovery. Gerald had looked at what was requested, and had provided what was requested, and had never once volunteered what had not been requested. It was, as he had explained to Marcus with careful neutrality, the precise boundary between transparency and gift. The next 18 months were the quietest of Marcus's professional life and the most productive. He kept the apartment. He kept the Silverado. He kept packing his lunch. He got to job sites before the foreman arrived. He marked problems with orange chalk and left notes on clipboards before anyone showed up to ask. His crews called him Ghost, a nickname that had followed him for 15 years, because he was always there before you expected him and gone before you knew he'd left. He did not speak about the divorce. He did not speak about Sandra. When people asked how he was doing, he said, working, and they believed him because it was always true. The logistics technology stake tripled in value. 18 months after Marcus signed the settlement papers, he had reinvested the distribution into 2 additional commercial properties, both of them acquired at below market rates, because Marcus had the capital, the patience, and the engineering knowledge to identify structural issues that scared off less informed buyers and that he could remedy at a cost he had already calculated to the dollar. The Eastern Corridor development broke ground. Marcus walked the site on a Tuesday morning in February, his boots on the packed earth, his breath visible in the cold air, and stood at the property line for a long moment before taking out his notebook and beginning the calculation he had been carrying in his head for 3 years. He was doing the calculation when his phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize, which was unusual because Marcus did not give his number to people he did not know. He answered, Mr. Ellington. A woman's voice, professional, clipped. My name is Reina Torres. I'm a partner at Meridian Capital Group. We've been following the Eastern Corridor project for approximately 18 months. I'd like to schedule 15 minutes of your time. Marcus looked out at the site. 30 workers moving across frozen ground with the precision of a system he had designed from the soil up. Thursday, he said. 8 a.m., Meridian Capital Group was a private equity firm with a portfolio that Marcus had researched in 40 minutes the evening before the Thursday meeting. They managed $2.3 billion in assets across real estate, infrastructure, and technology. Reina Torres had a law degree from Georgetown and an MBA from Wharton, and had closed 11 transactions over $100 million in the previous 4 years. She arrived at Gerald Park's conference room with one associate and a leather portfolio, and she did not waste time on pleasantries. She placed a term sheet on the table at minute 3. It was an acquisition offer for the Eastern Corridor development at a valuation that Marcus read once, sat down, and looked at without expression. "This is a serious number," he said. "We're a serious group." Reina Torres looked at him steadily. "We're also prepared to discuss a structure in which you retain an operating role and an equity position in the portfolio going forward, if that's preferable to a clean exit." "It might be," Marcus said. Gerald was reading the term sheet. He did not look up. His pen was moving. The negotiation took 6 weeks. Marcus did not celebrate during those 6 weeks. He went to job sites, he drank his coffee. A filled notebook, 42 with calculations related to the structural engineering challenges in the second phase of the corridor project. Challenges it was already solving regardless of how the deal resolved, because solving them was simply what you did when you saw a problem. He trusted Gerald and Dora to work the numbers. He weighed the equity retention offer against the clean exit, and chose the structure that gave him a continuing position in a smaller immediate payment and a larger long-term position. Because Marcus had always thought in decades. It was. His father had told him when Marcus was 17 years old and impatient, the only honest unit of time. The transaction closed on a Thursday afternoon. Marcus signed 14 documents. Gerald shook his hand. Dora sent a text that said simply, "Congratulations." Marcus drove home in the Silverado, parked in the lot behind his apartment building, and sat for a moment with the engine off. The radio had been off for the entire drive. The city was making its ordinary evening sounds around him. He got out, he went upstairs, he made dinner. He did not call anyone. He sat at the kitchen table with notebook 42 open in front of him and finished the calculation he had started 3 days earlier. It was correct. He capped his pen. The number. Once Gerald had accounted for every component of the portfolio: the corridor development, the commercial properties, the logistics technology position. 2 additional investments Marcus had made in the previous year was just over $500 million in combined asset value. It was not a liquid number. It was a structural number, the kind that existed in documents and deeds and equity schedules, and that did not move through bank accounts in ways that were visible to the outside world. It was the kind of wealth that Marcus had always believed in. Not performed, not announced, not worn, built. He learned that Sandra had found out on a Wednesday morning, 11 days after the transaction closed. He did not learn this from Sandra. He learned it from Isaiah, his oldest friend, who had been in the room when the deal was signed and who had the specific quality of delivering news with the maximum possible economy of words. Isaiah called and said, "She saw it." Marcus said, "I know." Isaiah said, "She's moving." Marcus said, "I expected that." Isaiah said nothing for a moment, and then said, "You good?" Marcus said, "Working." Isaiah laughed once, a short sound, and hung up. The call from Sandra's attorney arrived on a Friday. Not Sandra's attorney from the divorce, a new attorney, a man named Richard Castor, whose firm occupied 3 floors of a glass building downtown, and whose practice, as Marcus had confirmed through Gerald before the call was even returned, specialized in post-settlement, litigation, and asset recovery. Richard Castor left a message that was polished and careful, and that used the phrase "further equitable consideration" twice. Marcus listened to it once. He called Gerald. "She's filing a motion," Gerald said. "Post-settlement discovery. She's arguing that assets were concealed during the divorce proceedings." "Were they?" Marcus said. "No," Gerald said. "Everything that was requested was provided. Everything that was subpoenaed was produced. The holding structure was properly disclosed in the entity registration filings, which are public documents. No, one chose to look. A pause. Richard Castor will argue constructive concealment. He'll argue that a sophisticated party had an obligation to volunteer material information. And I'll be interested to hear him make that argument, Gerald said, with the particular tone of a man who has been in rooms like this many times and is not concerned. When can you come in? The conference room on the day Sandra's motion was filed was a different room than the one where the settlement had been signed. That room had been her attorney's, carpeted, warm-lit, lined with bookshelves staged for the purpose of looking impressive. This room was Gerald's, which meant it had white walls, a rectangular table, good light, and no performance in it at all. Sandra arribed with Richard Castor and a paralegal, and a demeanor that Marcus recognized. She had the posture of someone who had made a decision and was committed to the surface of it. She did not look at him when she sat down. She arranged her portfolio on the table in front of her with careful precision. She touched her earring once. Marcus sat across from her. He had a legal notepad and a pen and nothing else on the table in front of him. He had read every document in the motion. He had read every document 3 times. He was not concerned. He was curious, in the way he was always curious about structural problems, not anxious about them, but interested in the specific shape of the failure and what it revealed about the assumptions that had produced it. Richard Castor opened with a 15-minute statement that was practiced and well-organized, and that made a series of arguments that Marcus listened to without expression. The core of the argument was that Marcus had engaged in deliberate concealment of material assets during the divorce proceedings by organizing his holdings in a structure designed to avoid disclosure. Richard Castor used the word sophisticated 11 times in 15 minutes. He used the phrase fiduciary obligation 4 times. He spoke about the spirit of full financial disclosure with the tone of a man who believes very much in the spirit of things. Gerald let him finish. Gerald made a note on his legal pad. Gerald said, "Are you done?" Richard Castor said he was. Gerald opened the binder. He placed 7 documents on the table in a precise row. He said, "Entity registration, filed 7 years ago. Publicly available. Not subpoenaed." He placed another document. Discovery request from the initial proceedings, specific to Ellington Engineering, LLC. Responded to completely and accurately. Another document. Interrogatory responses. Each question answered as asked. No question asked about Ellington Holdings Group. Another document. The statutory framework governing disclosure obligations in marital dissolution proceedings in this state, specifically subsection 11, which defines the scope of mandatory disclosure as responsive to requests made. He looked up. "Mr. Castor, your client's counsel had 4 months of discovery and the resources of an experienced family law firm. The holding structure was not hidden. It was not disguised. It was registered with the state with a publicly accessible filing that has been in place for 7 years. No one looked." Gerald closed the binder. "I want to be respectful of everyone's time, so I'll say simply that this motion has no merit, that we will oppose it completely, and that in opposing it, we will introduce the full scope of the Ellington Holdings portfolio into the public record, which will include a forensic accounting of all assets and a timeline of their development that will make very clear to any review in court exactly what was built, when it was built, and what your client received in the settlement relative to the total estate." He folded his hands. "I'd encourage you to consider whether that's a record your client once made." Sandra looked at Marcos for the first time since she had walked into the room. He looked back at her. He did not say anything. The silence in the room ran for several seconds. The ventilation system ran behind the walls. Barely audible, a quiet mechanical sound that was the only thing moving. Sandra touched her earring again. She looked at her attorney. Richard Castor was writing on his notepad with the focused energy of a man who needs to appear to be doing something. He said, "We'll need time to review the materials you've referenced." "Of course," Gerald said. The motion was withdrawn. 14 days later, Gerald called Marcus on a Tuesday morning to tell him. Marcus was on a job site. He was standing at the base of a column with orange chalk in his hand. He listened, said thank you, ended the call, and turned back to the column. He met Sandra once more. It was 6 weeks after the motion was withdrawn. On a Thursday afternoon, at a coffee shop 2 blocks from the building where they had first had dinner 20 years earlier. She had called Gerald's office to request it. Marcos had agreed. He arrived at 2 p.m. and ordered his coffee and waited. She came in at 2:07. She looked well. She had the careful composure of someone who had rehearsed the first 30 seconds. She sat down. She ordered water. She looked at him across the small table. "I want to understand," she said, "how this happened." Marcos turned the coffee cup in his hands. He said, "You're asking how the assets got built. I'm asking how I didn't know." He considered that for a moment. "You didn't ask," he said. "Not once in 16 years." He said it without heat, without accusation, with the same matter-of-fact tone he used on job sites when he explained to a junior engineer why a calculation had failed. "I tried to show you the work a few times, early on. You weren't interested in the details. That was fair. You had your own work. I respected that." He paused. But the work kept getting done. Sandra looked at the table. She said, "I thought I knew what you were." "I know," Marcus said. "I thought." She stopped. She looked up. "You seemed like someone who was going to be exactly what I could already see." "Most people do," he said. "It's efficient." She laughed, a short sound, almost involuntary. It faded quickly. She looked at her water glass. "Is there anything you want to say to me?" Marcus thought about it honestly. He sat with the question the way he sat with structural problems, turning it over, looking at the load points. Then he said, "I built everything I built the same way I always did, because I believed in the work. You decided that wasn't enough before you ever thought to ask what else there might be." He set down the coffee cup. That's the whole story. They did not speak again. He did not watch her face when he said it. He had already looked at her enough. He stood, put on his jacket, and left the coffee shop. The afternoon light was low and angled, and the city was making its ordinary sounds. He walked to where the Silverado was parked, got in, and sat for a moment with the key in his hand. Not from grief, not from triumph. He sat because the moment deserved a second, because he had been carrying this particular weight for a long time, and he wanted to feel it lift before he put the truck in drive. He set the key in the ignition. He started the engine. He pulled out onto the street. 2 miles away, the Eastern Corridor site was preparing for the second phase of construction. It had a site review scheduled for 4 p.m. He was going to be there at 3:45. He was going to check the anchor bolt spacing on the north foundation wall, which 3 members of the engineering team had signed off on, and which Marcus had looked at once and wanted to look at again, because that was how he did things. You looked until you were sure. Then you looked one more time. He did not look in the rearview mirror. The work was ahead of him, exactly where it had always been, exactly where he had always known to find it. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.